Hi everyone, my name is Haley Zinda and I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Educator here in Wayne County for OSU Extension. And today we're going to be talking about heifer nutrition. So just a little bit on what we'll see today. We'll talk about a calf's evolution into a ruminant, the importance of water, creep feeding, growth guidelines, the rate of growth and its impact. And then we'll follow up with some tips and tricks. So we need to remember that calves aren't born with a fully developed rumen. When they're younger, calves will have about 30% of their GIT volume in the rumen reticulum and 60% in their abomasum, the true gastric compartment. However, as they mature, it'll be about 84% of the volume as the rumen reticulum and only 4% as the abomasum. We also have to remember dairy farming condenses a 6 to 9 month process to 8 to 12 weeks. And so what we feed will determine the success of rumen development. The importance of grain and creep feeding is apparent with these three photos. On the left-hand side is a photo of a rumen epithelial wall that was only offered milk. The middle is milk and hay, and the far right is milk and grain. And as you can see, having both milk and grain stimulated the most papillae development in the rumen. So how are we going to best support rumen development? We want to introduce grain quickly, around 3 weeks of age. We can also include forage in the diet in small doses because it can limit grain intake if offered at too high a concentration in the diet. Originally thought it contributed scratch factor, but it doesn't actually do that in the diet. But including grain and hay may increase rumen weight for overall greater rumen development. But lastly, we need to make sure that we're providing water. Calves can officially be weaned once they consume about 1% of their body weight in grain per day. However, we can also provide a high allowance of milk to create a gradual weaning process. But it's important to note that grain is the feed that best supports rumen papillae development. Butyrate is the VFA byproduct of grain digestion. And butyrate is going to be the VFA or volatile fatty acid that best supports rumen development because it stimulates capillary development in the rumen epithelium, which means the rumen will have greater nutrient absorption capacity and carrying ability later on in life. So what's a good calf starter? It'll be 16 to 20% crude protein. It'll be highly palatable with molasses or other flavorings. And it'll typically have oats or or wheat as the grain. It'll have a digestible fiber, especially if we're not offering forage as a part of the calf's diet. And it'll also contain a coccidiostat, and like Decox or Bovatec. This is just an example of a step-down weaning program from Penn State Extension. And you can see here that in our low, we start off with 1.46 pounds of milk replacer per day and about 1 pound of starter grain. And then in our high treatment, we start off with a greater amount of milk replacer and less grain. But by the end of it, when the calf is weaned, they'll be intaking more starter grain per day than the calves that were on the low milk replacer diet. Here's another study that was done on water intake with creep feeding in calves. So calves are going to be getting water anyway through milk because it's going to be 88 to 90% water as it is. But by including extra drinking water, we can increase and maintain their water intake throughout the whole weaning process. Providing free choice water has shown to increase dry matter intake by about 33%. The calves will eat more calf starter and decrease scours and mitigate dehydration effects of scours, of course. And then there is also another study that shows that temperature of water can also help increase water intake, especially in cold months. By just warming that water a little bit, we can increase their water intake. When we talk about growth guidelines, this is a pretty typical chart of our different breeds, along with their ideal breeding weights and calving weights. So for our Holsteins, they're going to be born at about 100 pounds. and they should be breeding at 50 to 55% of their mature body weight, meaning they'll be around 750 to 850 pounds. And that'll be at 13 to 15 months of age. And then fast forward to calving, they should be calving at 80 to 85% of their mature body weight. So that means they'll be 1,200 to 1,300 pounds at 22 to 24 months of age, meaning they'll gain about 1.7 pounds per day, and they'll end up with a mature body weight of about 1,500 pounds. And it's the same for our mid-size and small dairy breeds. Really, that 50 to 55% mature body weight metric at breeding and the 80 to 85% mature body weight at calving are the numbers that we need to keep in mind, regardless of what the final mature body weights are going to be. This is just a different way to look at guidelines. This is from Penn State. So not only do we have body weight recommendations, but we also have wither and hip height recommendations as well. Because we might have an animal that is, at that 750, 850 pound mark for a Holstein, and she's ready to breed. But is she really ready to breed, or is she overweight? So that way we can take a look here. If she's under that wither height and hip height of about 50 inches, it might mean that she's just overweight and a little bit chunky for her size. When we chart and compare growth, this will help us to see if she's on track or not. So, at birth or 1 month of age, a Holstein calf might be at that 100, 125 pound body weight range. And then ideal or average growth rate would be this black line here. Cows, or I should say heifers that grow quickly, might be in this 95th percentile light blue range. So she'd be, very at the top of her group. But on the other hand, she could be growing quite slowly and be down in this 5th percentile range, which is the bottom light blue section. So if we shoot for that median range, she will not grow too quickly, not grow too slowly, but be on track for that 50% and 80% breeding and calving weights for her age. This is a similar look at that same graph, but it also has labels of when she's going to go through puberty, when you can breed her, and at calving. So if you can imagine, that center line that we saw earlier, the median, would be cutting right through those two center blue lines. And if she's growing quickly, that means she's likely going to reach puberty sooner. She can probably be bred a little bit sooner. But, we want to make sure that we're not breeding her too early or too young. And then that means she'll probably calve sooner. But I think on the other end, which is probably more detrimental, if she's growing too slowly, she's underweight, she won't reach puberty as quickly. She won't be able to be bred as quickly, which means she's going to be on feed a lot longer before she can become a productive member of the herd. And it'll be much more expensive to raise her. Now, most heifers, they will be in that, that's 7.75 pound per day, or I should say kilogram per day, excuse me. But Jerseys can safely go down to that 0.55 and be good just because they're a smaller breed. Now, there are a few different time points in a heifer's life that we need to worry about. So we've got weaning to breeding. And so weaning to breeding is going to be a critical time of development for the heifer. There's going to be major mammary growth in that 3 to 9 months of age mark. So we want to avoid excess fat deposition in the mammary gland. We can safely push heifers to gain about 2 pounds per day for muscle development, and we need to meet her metabolizable protein requirement for lean growth. So metabolizable protein is going to be the protein that actually reaches the small intestine and that can be used for her own use and not for the microbes in the rumen. Overfeeding energy will just lead to extra fat deposition. But on that same note, heifers reaching or getting more energy will hit puberty sooner, but they will not reach their full milk potential because of extra fat deposition in the mammary gland. This is the diet, energy and protein requirements for large breed dairy heifers gaining 0.8 kilograms per day, or just under, or just about 2 pounds per day in a thermal neutral environment. So as calves get larger, of course, their dry matter intake is going to increase. However, their crude protein is going to decrease just because they're getting larger and they will be intaking more grams of protein per day. Therefore, the concentration of the protein in the diet can decrease. And then their metabolizable energy will also decrease as they are, and mcals per pound will decrease as well for that same, essentially, dilution point that I have just made. Now, when we're feeding in that period from breeding to calving, we need to shift our focus to maintain growth rate and minimize fat deposition. As any animal matures, ourselves included, the rate of lean tissue deposition is going to decrease. So, as we get older, as animals get older, the more they eat, the more likely they are to put on fat stores instead of muscle. Fat heifers at calving can lead to dystocia, metabolic problems, and lower milk production. So we want to really avoid that. So in summary, we want to strive for a 3.5. So strive for a 3.5 at calving. Any larger than this, and they may have some calving difficulties. Any less than this, and they may have a hard time bouncing back from severe weight loss of early lactation. And so lastly, we're going to wrap up with some quality control in heifer nutrition. There are 6 main points. 1 is defining feed cost. 2 is having different monitoring systems. 3, managing variance. 4, controlling feed cost. 5, calling heifers. And 6 is developing a management team. And because this is a nutrition presentation, we're going to look at number 4, which is controlling our feed cost. Now, feed is 60 to 70% of heifer raising costs. And so we want to make sure that we are doing it as cost effectively as possible. We can control our nutrients to have a handle on costs, and we don't want to brush aside heifer requirements either. Bringing us to the point that heifers are their own animal. They're not lactating cows yet. They have their own set of nutrient requirements that we need to make sure we're meeting. A nutritionist for the herd is going to use the nutrient requirements of dairy cattle. The most recent edition just came out last year. We need to feed her to requirements and not over and not under, to make sure that she is staying on track with growth. And so this book will have all different stages of life in there. And of course, it'll have birth to weaning, weaning to breeding, breeding to calving. And then we'll have requirements for all of our lactating cows as well. Secondly, we'll need to adjust our ration to changing environments. Our weather isn't static, and rations shouldn't be either. Cows can go through heat stress, cold stress, extreme wind and cold, and wet lying areas, and those can all affect how much energy the cow actually needs. So in heat stress and cold stress, cows will need extra energy to either sweat or shiver. And wet lying areas can, decrease the cow's body temperature. And on that same note, increased energy intake will help them maintain body temperature. Now, keep in mind that 300-pound and 1,000-pound heifers are going to handle environmental change differently. So a 300-pound heifer has less body weight to body surface, whereas our 1,000-pound animals are going to have much more body weight to body surface than our 300-pound heifers. So, the smaller the weight to surface area ratio is, the more likely they are to experience some sort of heat or cold stress. And then sometimes improving facilities can do more than just upping the energy of the diet. So if it's quite a drafty barn, chances are those cows are going to continue to need more and more energy just to maintain their body temperature. And not only that, but sometimes draftiness in the wintertime can also lead to cracked and frozen teat ends. So we can improve our facilities to decrease the feed costs that we might need to incur. We also want to avoid overconditioning. Kind of touched on this already. While increased energy is sometimes needed, like in times of heat stress and cold stress, it shouldn't be a constant increase in energy. Eventually, we're going to have to back off of that because cows can eventually become overconditioned, heifers can become overconditioned, and it won't be conducive for calving and milk production. We can either limit their feed or feed low quality, low energy forage to at least meet their bulk and dry matter intake. And so straw is one I see used a lot in heifer diets to do just that. We can also produce high tonnage forages. And because forage is a major part of dairy diets, reducing production cost of forages can also reduce overall ration cost. Increasing yield on top of reducing production costs are additional savings. So we can choose different varieties, we can change cutter heights, increase plant populations, or delay our harvest to increase our yield. I'm sorry, I said increase cutter height. I mean decrease cutter height. Increased cutter height would only be beneficial if we were in times of drought and there were nitrate concentrations in the stock. But heifers are going to benefit from several low-cost, high-tonnage crops, and that goes for our lactating cows as well. Different types of these crops can be corn stalks, sorghum silage, sweet corn silage, mid-blue alfalfa silage, straw, low-quality grass hay, sorghum Sudan grass silage, and small grain silage when it's at the head stage. Also feed protein wisely. So protein requirements start high, and then I should say percentage in the diet start high and decrease with maturity just because they'll be intaking more grams per day. And protein is going to be the most expensive macronutrient. So to keep more money in our pockets, we also want to avoid overfeeding protein. And chances are, if we're overfeeding, it's going to end up in the urine anyway. So excess nitrogen is going to come out in urine in the form of urea, and then will be lost as ammonia to the environment. Again, if we can feed appropriate levels of protein, we can have proper body frame development. So think back to the metabolizable protein point that I made earlier, and we'll have less nitrogen loss to the environment. We also want to feed vitamins and minerals precisely. So feeding to requirement and not over requirement is definitely a recurring theme of this presentation. It increases costs and it could lead to some unwanted mineral interactions. So it could actually be counterproductive than what we're trying to do. We also want to avoid free choice minerals. Don't give the animals a choice in what they want to consume. Have that put in the TMR already so that it's going to all be in the same mouthful. And then we can always test our forages for mineral content. They might just surprise you. And so if we have an appropriate amount of phosphorus or potassium in the forages we're feeding, chances are we're not going to need to supplement that with loose mineral in the feed itself. That one point down here I want to mention is do not overfeed phosphorus. Phosphorus will come out in the manure, and once that's applied to the fields, that can lead to runoff and not so nice environmental outcomes. So the number one way to reduce phosphorus output in the manure is to reduce it in the diet. Of course, we want to make sure that the cows are getting what they need, but we don't want to overfeed them. Decreasing refusals is going to be another way to control your feed cost. Wasted feed is shrink, and shrink increases cost. That's not a new concept. So shrink you might think of as feed just lost from its storage area. So think commodity bays or just some covered areas where feed might be stockpiled. But in our feed bunks, we can also figure out how much feed is being lost in that way. We can score feed bunks. 0 is going to be a clean bunk. There's nothing left. This 0.5 is going to be just scattered grain across. 1 will be a thin layer of feed over the entire bunk. A 2 would be 25 to 50% of the feed remaining, and we really don't want to go any higher than a 2, of course. And this bunk scoring system is very popular in slick bunk management for beef cattle feedlots. But we can also use it to help with our dairy feed shrink too. We're never going to want our feed bunks to be, a 0 or a 0.5. But if we shoot for that one score of 1 all the time, then, we're not going to be overfeeding too much to reduce costs, but we're also not going to be limiting their intake either. If for some reason there is a score of 0 ever on the feed bunk, you want to increase your feed offering by about 5%. And if we are well above, if we're in that 1 or 2 or 3 range, we're going to want to back off feed so that we're not overfeeding and increasing refusals. Using ionophores and growth promoters can be another great option to improve just feed efficiency in general in growing heifers. So they have shown a 10 to 15% increase in feed efficiency when used in dairy heifers, and a lot of these are also going to control coccidiosis. They are considered coccidiostats. But if we are using a TMR system for our dairy heifers, we want to come up with some sort of quality control system, and that's through testing our feed. You can't tell the nutrient content of a feed by just looking at it or smelling it. We really need to get a nutrient analysis, or at least a dry matter, once a week to figure out what we're actually feeding. Eventually, it will be worth your time and money because it could mean reduced protein, or purchased protein costs, could mean reduced mineral cost, and then that will save you dollars in the long run. Just one last point I want to make your animals fit your system and not the other way around. If you have some hard keeping heifers, hard keeping cows, there's a lot of management strategies that work, and maybe they need something specific. But if that's not something you're doing on your operation, it's not worth keeping them around, because there will be another animal down the pike that will fit your management strategy, and you won't need to spend more money on feed, more money on veterinary costs, just to make them do their job in the herd. So even if you do everything perfectly, there will always be poor keepers. So just go ahead and call them before you spend more money on them not to perform to their potential. In summary, heifer nutrition is its own program. They aren't cows just yet. We need to treat heifers as their own little beasts that they are. There are ways to control costs in a heifer raising system and a dairy system. And make sure to benchmark your animals. Monitor them to see how they compare to each other, and then, of course, to animals outside your farm as well. Thanks for listening. Go ahead and shoot me an email or give me a call. I'd be happy to answer any more of your questions. Thanks so much.